Okay, welcome everyone. Hello to all of you joining live. It's good to see you all, and to everyone watching and listening to the recording. So today is a special occasion. We have the pleasure of hosting Dr. Heidi Warncke, who'll be sharing some highlights and insights to some of the treasures at the Etz Chaim Library in Amsterdam in Holland, which, as we know and we tell us, is the oldest functioning Jewish library in the world. So before I introduce our esteemed and accomplished guest, I wanted to just say a few words as to why this particular session is so important to us at the Chabura. It's no secret that one of the core objectives of the Chabura is to raise awareness of the classical Sephardic tradition. And this means studying and appreciating the different traditions that have carried that legacy of Maimonides and the Golden Age of Spain into modern times. And the Western Sephardic tradition has to this very day preserved that worldview, the approach to Torah and culture. And considering we work very closely with the Spanish and Portuguese community in the UK, it certainly makes a lot of sense that we have this discussion and presentation today. And as we know, this library is not just a collection of old books. It's evidence, beautiful evidence of this rich tradition and the Sephardic spirit that has endured through centuries of challenges, expulsion, persecution, and different ideologies. So this library is a physical manifestation of the ideas and teachings that we wish to shine a light on and bring, raise awareness of, and therefore, showing this repository of wisdom and thought is very fitting and appropriate, an important part of our mission. Dr. Heidi was born in Hamburg and studied Semitic languages at the University of Amsterdam. In 2012, she started working at the library at Etz Chaim, Livraria Montesinos de Amsterdam, and was appointed curator in 2016. She's currently writing a dissertation with the title Amsterdam Hebrew Printing Industry and the Impact of Intellectual, Economic, and Religious Developments on Hebrew Printing. So without further ado, let's jump right in and explore some of these treasures.
Avi, thank you very much for this introduction. I'll first share my screen with you. I hope that you can see it now, I guess. Sure. Perfect. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me and for giving me the opportunity to tell you something about the collection of the library at Schem in Amsterdam. It not only is a beautiful library, it holds unique books and manuscripts, and it's a pleasure to share that with you. The title of my presentation is taken from a manuscript that we have in the collection, which basically is about a scholar who devoted his life to learning. He's sitting in his room full of books and says, "Here I travel through heaven and earth." We have a couple of these manuscripts with library images in our collection, and I'm sure that sitting in a room full of books, traveling through heaven and earth is something we can all relate to. I would like to start by giving you some background about the history of the Portuguese Jews here in Amsterdam, because I feel without knowing something about it, it will be very difficult to understand what makes Etz Chaim so unique. So tonight I will take you on a journey to the Iberian Peninsula, and I will show you some beautiful manuscripts and printed books that we hold in Etz Chaim. And many of those books reveal a strong Iberian identity, and we will get an idea that the heart of the immigrants to Amsterdam was still very much on the Iberian Peninsula. So this is Etz Chaim. It's the oldest active Jewish library in the world. It's on the premises of the Portuguese synagogue, and it's part of the Jewish cultural quarter in Amsterdam. The synagogue is lit with candlelight, and there's no electricity or heating. It's absolutely beautiful. I hope you have been there, and if you haven't, that you will have a chance to go there. It's really amazing. Well, I promised to take you on a journey to the Iberian Peninsula, and I have to say that this is history in a will be history in a nutshell. Many books have been written about this, and there's much more to tell than I can do here and now. This is a map from the Iberian Peninsula at the end of the 15th century. From the 2nd century until the 15th century, the Jewish community on the Iberian Peninsula was the largest in the world. Under Islamic rule from 711 on, there was a time of relative tolerance towards Jews and Christians that lasted until the Reconquista, the reconquering of land on the peninsula by Christians. And this tolerance is called convivencia, which literally means living next to each other. I have to say here that this is a little bit romanticized, at least this is what I think. Through all the ages, there were also conflicts, persecution, and forced conversions. But culturally and intellectually, this was a very productive and stimulating time. In the year 1478, the Reconquista was nearing its end when the Inquisition was established in Spain. When in 1492, the last Moorish stronghold, Granada, came into the hands of the Catholics, the fate of the Jews on the peninsula was sealed. On the 31st of March 1492, the Alhambra decree, which is the edict of expulsion of the Jews, was signed. Jews who wanted to keep their faith had to leave Spain, and Jews who wanted to stay had to convert to Catholicism. And the time frame for this was just 3 months. Because of his function at the royal court and his excellent relation with royalty in Spain, the great philosopher Isaac ben Yehuda Abarvanel was able to postpone the date of the expulsion to August 2nd. And why that specific date? He was very much aware of the historical impact of the expulsion on Jewish history. So he postponed until the 9th day of the month Av, the day of the destruction of the temples in Jerusalem, the day of mourning, Tisha B'Av. This works. So I would like to show you on this map that the years 1492, the expulsion from Spain, and 1536, the Inquisition in Portugal, led to 2 different flows of refugees, and with that to 2 parts of the Sephardic diaspora. In 1492, many Jews fled from Spain to northern Africa in the eastern part of the Mediterranean, the Ottoman Empire, Italy, Greece. Many went to Portugal hoping to stay out of the hands of the Inquisition. But that plan didn't work out. In 1497, the Jews in Portugal were also forced to convert, and 1 year later, there were no Jews left on the Iberian Peninsula. When the Inquisition in Portugal was formally established in 1536, the Jews, conversos by that time, fled back to Spain and to the western part of the mainland, to France, Antwerp, Amsterdam, and later Hamburg and London. And in Spain, this group was called Portuguese Jews, and those are the people who came to Amsterdam and were also called Portuguese Jews here in Amsterdam. The converted Jews were called New Christians, Christaos Novos, or Conversos, and later, to denigrate the Jews, Marranos. And the word Marrano pig was mainly used by Christians who assumed that some Conversos kept to their Jewish tradition in secret. Jews themselves called the Conversos Anusim, forced ones, or Meshumadim, converts. So in general, we can say that the eastern part of the Sephardic diaspora, the Ottoman Empire, consists of Jews, whereas the western part, Antwerp, Amsterdam, Hamburg, London, consisted of conversos. And why is this important? Because in the eastern part, there was a continuity of Jewish tradition, and in the western part, for example, in Amsterdam, there was no continuity. So in Amsterdam, the Jews had to start from scratch, learning about Jewish tradition, customs, and identity. Amsterdam was focused on a converso community, and that focus defines the character of the library at Schiim. It is the library of the school of the congregation and reflects the need for education. In the spring of the year 1593, the first conversos arrived in Amsterdam. At first, services took place in private houses, for example, in the house of Jacob Tirado. And the story is that Tirado sailed with other conversos in a vessel from the Iberian Peninsula when the vessel was driven out of its course to the city of Emden in Friesland, the north of Holland, or Germany, I have to say. And there he met the Ashkenazic Rabbi Moses Uri Halevi, who gave him the advice to go to Amsterdam, and he also helped him to establish the first congregation there. We are not quite sure if this account is true, but of all the myths of settlement around Sephardic, or the myths around Sephardic settlement in Amsterdam, this one is the most likely. Tirado acquired a house on the Houtgracht in Amsterdam, which in 1602 he transformed into Amsterdam's first Sephardic congregation and synagogue, which was called after him Beit Yaakov. And this is a Torah shield that Tirado and his wife gave to the Portuguese congregation in 1606. Two other congregations were founded around the year 1608, Neve Shalom, and in 1618, Bet Israel. All those three congregations merged into one called Talmud Torah in 1639 and gathered in this building, Bet Israel. As I said earlier, on the Iberian Peninsula, the conversos were cut off Judaism and Jewish traditions for many generations, and they had to find their Jewish identity. So education was of the essence. And that meant that already in 1616, as part of the synagogue Beit Israel that we see here, the school was founded that also housed a library. And through the years, the name of the school and the library became Etz Chaim. In 1675, the congregation, school, and library at Chaim moved to the premises of the newly built Portuguese synagogue that you've seen earlier. Since its foundation, Etz Chaim has always employed a librarian, and by far the most influential of these was David Montesinos, who served the library for 50 years. You see him here on your left. In 1889, he decided to give his private book collection to Etz Chaim, and hence the current name of the library, Etz Chaim Livraria Montesinos. Well, take a look at the stove and the inkwells on the table, which are a nightmare for every librarian in our days, and in those days, we're talking about the 19th century, early 20th century. This was how the library at Chaim actually looked like. Today, the library holds about 600 manuscripts and 23,000 printed books, and it is the oldest active Jewish library in the world. I think I said it earlier, it's more than 400 years old. It's mainly a research library for scholars from around the world, so everyone who wants to do research in the library can make an appointment and is more than welcome to browse through our books. As well as Hebrew books, the collection contains many, I have to say, as well as Hebrew books, the collection contains many Portuguese and Spanish manuscripts and printed works. In general, we can say that Spanish was the language of the literature, and Portuguese the language for everyday life and the administration of the congregation. And Ladino was never spoken in the Portuguese congregation in Amsterdam because it's the language of the first wave of Jews who fled Spain as Jews. This is a book from our collection, that was printed when the Portuguese synagogue was inaugurated in 1675. I don't know if you know, but the inauguration actually took 8 full days, and every day another rabbi held a sermon. This is a very beautiful book because it also holds a little manuscript, which you can see on the left, bottom left. And it tells us more about the prices of building. It's all in Portuguese. You can read, for example, where the building material came from and what the costs of the building were. We also learn from it that apparently during building the synagogue, someone died. One of the builders died. We don't know exactly how and why, but this manuscript list tells us that his widow received a sum of money because he died during building the synagogue. So it's not only beautiful and tells us about the ceremony, but it also tells us a lot about other things that were going on. For example, who gave the most amount of money? Also very important to know, I guess. The first sermon was held by Chacham Isaac Abob da Fonseca. You see him here, and he was also the man who took the initiative to build the synagogue. He realized that the congregation was growing, and he was a very smart man. He before he even informed his board of governors, the Mahamat, the Parnasim, he already went to some people in his congregation and he asked for money. So with that bag of money, he went to the Mahamat and they couldn't say no anymore. So I think it was a very smart move because the congregation was growing and they really needed a new and bigger synagogue. In the book, you will also find this engraving of the inauguration ceremony. And what you see here is a procession with, at its head, Chacham Yitzhak Abob da Fonseca, carrying the Torah scrolls to the Hechal. And what you also see in the front are festively dressed burgomasters, women, and aldermen of Amsterdam. They were very welcome to be at the inauguration ceremony, and of course, every citizen of Amsterdam was very curious to see what was going on all that time during building behind those walls. So they were very interested to see that as well. Especially in the first half of the 17th century, rabbis from the eastern part of the Sephardic diaspora came to Holland. Joseph Pardo from Venice, Judah Vega from Constantinople, Isaac Uzziah from Fez, and Saul Levi Motera from Venice, and many, many more. Of course, these are just a few names. Those rabbis who didn't have a converso background corrected, so to speak, the Catholic elements and took care of uniform rules according to halacha. And Venice played a very important normative role and was the religious authority for the Amsterdam Jewish community. And the reason is that Venice had an institutional continuity which served as a seal of quality for Amsterdam. That correcting the Catholic elements was indeed necessary was clear from the very beginning when the newcomers to Amsterdam called the matzes, holy bread, and Purim, the feast of the Holy Esther. And we know from recent research that the Jews on the Iberian Peninsula only encountered Rabbinic Judaism in the 9th century. And again, because of the Inquisition, there was no continuation of this. And this is illustrated by a document. We don't have it in our library, but it is such a good example of what I just said. So there is a document drawn up by the Inquisition from the year 1625, and it is a list of persons who were put to an auto da fe, a public trial in Coimbra in Portugal. And on this list, we find a converso who is accused of secretly celebrating Pesach. And there is a description of the feast, and the description is standing on bare feet with a staff in the hand. They are the lamb and the unleavened bread. They ate the lamb and the unleavened bread. And of course, this is not how Pesach was celebrated in Jewish communities in 1625, reading from the Haggadah, but according to the instructions in Shemot 12:11. So clearly the Jews in Portugal were not familiar with this tradition, which developed in a time that the conversos didn't have access to rabbinic Judaism. So here in Amsterdam, immediately education was provided for the newcomers to close the gap of the many generations of conversos who knew little about their own Jewish tradition anymore. This is the former classroom of Etzrim, and it is now used as the winter synagogue. It's called winter synagogue or small synagogue because, as I said earlier, the bigger synagogue, the Snogen, the Esnoga, there is no heating or electricity in there. So in the winter, the services are held, when it's very cold, the services are held in the winter synagogue. Life in the 17th century was very much centered around the religious community, the school of the congregation, and the library at Etzrim. And as a result, the collection of Etzrim provides an excellent insight into the mind and daily life of the so-called New Jews. And Avi said it before, it's an outstanding reflection of the range of thought and ideas of this young community. So you can see much more than just a book. It's much more than just a book or just a collection. And when it comes to education, starting with the Hebrew alphabet until the highest Talmud studies, also the trivium, so grammar, rhetoric, and logic, essential to a classical education, was part of the curriculum. And secular subjects that were not on the curriculum in other Jewish schools in Europe, like didactic poetry, for example. And special attention was also given to translations from and into Spanish, the literary language of the congregation. The school of Etzrim was seen as unique in the Jewish world in the 17th century and impressed and moved many visitors, especially because of the excellent quality of the curriculum. The focus of the Portuguese congregation on learning Torah before the rabbinic text impressed many visitors, especially from Eastern Europe. And we know this from an eyewitness account in this book, Shnei Luchot HaBrit, in our collection, written by Jesaja Hurwitz and printed in Amsterdam in 1648 and again in 1695. In an appendix called Vavei HaAmudim, written by Shabtai Schefter Hurwitz, the educational system of the school Etzrim is praised, and I quote, "I saw there at Etzrim that little children learned Torah, and after that the rest of the Bible, then Mishnah, and only when they are 13 years old, they learn to read the Talmud. With tears in my eyes, I wondered why we don't do this in our congregation," and that congregation very likely was Prague. "May this tradition spread through the whole Jewish world." So this is an eyewitness account of someone visiting Etzrim, which says it all, I feel. The title page of this book, Shnei Luchot HaBrit, is a wonderful bridge to the famous Amsterdam Haggadah in our collection also, because the engraver of both title pages was the same. His name was Abraham Bar Jacob. So here you see an overview of some of the beautiful copper engravings in the Amsterdam Haggadah, printed in 1695. In this Amsterdam Haggadah, for the first time in Jewish book history, copper engravings were used instead of woodcuts. And the printers were so proud of this fact that they mentioned this on the title page. And they say it is printed with copper plates. Gerut aluchot nechoshet. Also here it says that this procedure was felt as the elevation of light above darkness. The makers saw in this new technique a fulfillment of the Talmudic concept of chidu mitzvah, beautification of the commandment. The Amsterdam Haggadah was printed by an Ashkenazic printing house, and addresses the Ashkenazic and Sephardic tradition. The instructions are both in Yiddish and Ladino. And also the shortened commentary of Abravanel's Chukat HaPesach is included. So here you see some of the engravings again in the Haggadah. So they were made by Abraham Bar Jacob, who actually was a priest who came to Amsterdam from the Rhineland of Germany, became an engraver and converted to Judaism in 1689 in Amsterdam. And this is all that we know about this man. He used the original copper plates of the Swiss engraver Matthäus Merian the Elder of Basel, that he made for his Protestant Bible, Icones Biblicae, and for his world history, the historical chronicle, which is an interesting fact because, well, actually the copper engravings in this Amsterdam Haggadah, the basic copper engraving is from a Protestant Bible, adapted by this engraver. Bar Jacob not just copied the engravings of Merian, he altered them and sometimes combined different images into one. In general, he tried to adapt the images to the context of the Haggadah, but he didn't always succeed or do so. I feel in many cases it was a conscious decision not to adapt it too much. I'll show you here. A good example are the 5 wise men in Bnei Barak. On this engraving, we don't see 5 people, but 9. And this is because the original copper plate is an image of the meal of Joseph offered to his brothers in Egypt, in Bereshit, actually. In the book, we also find a map which shows the route of the Exodus from Egypt and some other scenes like Jonah and the whale, beehives, and cows as symbols for the land of milk and honey. I don't know if you can see it. I guess it's rather small. The map is very, very interesting. I think I could talk about this map for half an hour at least, because there are so many other aspects to it that make it very interesting. But maybe that's for another time. So just to give you an idea how the Jewish engraver adapted the Christian copper plates, here you see the 4 sons. And this, I hope you can see it under the images of yourself. I can't see it now, but you will. So here I show the son who does not know how to ask. Then Miriam's example in mirror image, and the greater picture in which this figure is featured. So to give you an idea how this process of adapting happened actually. The Amsterdam Haggadah was so revolutionary in its thought that it influenced the topics of illustrations, composition, and layout of many printed Haggadot to this day. And what is also interesting, that especially in the 18th century, there was a revival of Hebrew illuminated manuscripts. And these manuscripts illustrations were influenced by the Amsterdam Haggadah. And I can give you an example. So this is the title page of the printed Amsterdam Haggadah from 1695. And here you see, this is a manuscript, by the way, which is held in the Jewish Museum, not in Etzreim, but just to make my point here, I want to show it to you. This is the title page of a Haggadah manuscript made by Nathan of Meseritz from Moravia in 1728, so roughly 35 years later. It's very much alike, especially the figures of Moses and Aaron. And another example, let me see, my cursor doesn't work. Now it does. Another example, here we have the 4 sons again. And these are the 4 sons in the Leibniz Haggadah from 1734, also from the collection of the Jewish Museum. And if you look at the clothing, he reinterpreted the Haggadah for his own time by depicting figures in the 18th century European dress and surroundings. So it's completely different. But when you look at those four sons in the Meseretz Haggadah, you can see that those are an exact copy of the four sons in the Amsterdam Haggadah. So it's very interesting to see how the printing tradition influenced the manuscript tradition in the 18th century. It's fascinating, also maybe to do more research on it. This is also from the collection of Etz Chaim. This is an Omer counter, and well, it's so beautiful that you would like. I would like to put it on my wall somewhere. The image. It's of course the 49 days between Pesach and Shavuot, the days of the Omer, and the Omer is a certain amount of grain which was given to the priest in Jerusalem as an offering. It's originally the harvesting time, and by counting the days at a time when there was no set calendar, yet the workers in the field knew exactly when to come home to celebrate Shavuot. And Omer counters can have many shapes. Within the Portuguese congregation in Amsterdam, beautifully illuminated scrolls were kept in cabinets to count the days of the Omer. And just a couple of those still exist. This one is from the 18th century, and having this Omer counters in a little cabinet is typically a Western Sephardic phenomenon. The letters that you see on there stand for Omer. The age is Omer, and that is because the Portuguese Jews, whenever they saw an Ein, they would represent it by an H. And the S is semana for week, and the D is dia for day. And in Amsterdam from 1624 on, Shavuot was celebrated in a very special manner. A theater play was performed in the synagogue. It was about the battle between the two mountains, Sinai and Zion, about who should have the honor to receive the Torah. And this, what you see here, actually is the theater play, a manuscript of the theater play. It had a religious intention and a didactic function. Those kinds of performances were very common in Spain, and a typical example of a tradition that was introduced in Amsterdam as part of the identity of this congregation. The subject is, of course, very Jewish, but the form is completely Iberian. And most of the board members of the congregation at the beginning of the 17th century didn't have an Iberian background, and they weren't at all happy with this tradition. So in 1636, these kind of theater plays were forbidden, actually. So they were not performed in the synagogue anymore. It is obvious that continuing the Iberian poetry and theater tradition in Amsterdam meant that a piece of Iberian identity was actually taken along. In general, by looking at the collection, it becomes clear that the Iberian identity was cherished, and I will show you an example here. These are some manuscripts, some title pages of manuscripts that we hold. And if you look at it, they really have a very distinctive Iberian character. And what I did here on this next slide, I just wanted to give you an idea. I wanted to compare Islamic art from the 10th and 11th century with some details from our manuscripts. And at the left, you see Medinat al-Zahara. It was a walled city, the administrative capital of Al-Andalus, very close to Cordoba. So it's really striking to see how Iberian in art, in feel, our title pages still were many years after the congregation formed and the Amsterdam Jews actually settled in Amsterdam. The expulsion from Spain in the 15th century marked a change in focus. Zionism and apocalyptic thoughts became important, and the Amsterdam community began to search for signs of when the long-awaited Messiah would come to bring them to the Holy Land. The board of the congregation was quite aware and also quite critical of these mystic tendencies. In the summer of the year 1665, the news arrived in Amsterdam that a man called Shabtai Tzvi from Smyrna, now Istanbul, called himself the Messiah of the Jews. In less than 6 months after his proclamation in July 1665, the world was at his feet. Gazettes and newspapers were printed in Amsterdam, and eyewitnesses' accounts and stories of miracles that had happened reached the city. And one of the reasons was that most of the Sephardic Jews had family, business, or contacts in the Ottoman Empire, and they received their information about these miracles, about Shabtai Tzvi, straight from the source, straight from those people. And when letters from Nathan of Gaza arrived in Amsterdam, everything seemed to be confirmed. Interestingly enough, little evidence of this episode is found in the archives or in the library at Sreim. What we do know is that Ashkenazic and Sephardic Jews sold everything, including their houses, and were dancing on the streets of Amsterdam because they believed that the end of their exile was near. A remarkable manuscript in the collection and evidence of how the congregation was affected is a letter that was written by 24 famous leaders of the Portuguese congregation in Amsterdam to hail Shabtai Tzvi as Messiah. It is, for example, I mean, there are many more names on it, but one of the people who signed it was Chacham Oliveira, who later held one of the sermons at the inauguration in the synagogue. The letter says, is written to Tzvi and says something like, where are you? What exactly should we do? Should we come to you, or are you coming to us? And this letter was actually sent, but well, I know you know, it never reached him, but I will tell you more about that later. Because before that, I would like to tell you something about the script that was used in this letter to Shabtai Tzvi. The writing style of this letter is pre-expulsion Sephardic script, which means that nearly 200 years after the expulsion, this ancient script was used in a letter which was written in 1666. Why? Because it fitted neatly into the idea of the Sephardic roots and would have meant an immediate connection between Shabtai Tzvi and the Amsterdam Jews, because Shabtai Tzvi also was Sephardic. And again, it expresses Iberian identity. It expresses something like, you are one of us, or we are one of yours. What happened around that year is that Jewish life in Amsterdam changed. Prayers that normally would have been said for the local king were now said for Shabtai Tzvi. And prayer books were printed showing Tzvi on his throne. The printer David de Castro Tartas, the Amsterdam printer, says on the title page that it was printed in year 1 after the coming of the Messiah. And this illustrates that the coming of the Messiah was not something that would or might happen in the future, but it was something that very much happened or would happen in present, and it became reality. By the way, after this episode, the printer Tartas didn't print for a whole year. He was very much traumatized by this episode. And very few traces are found in Etzraim, as there seems to be evidence that this unfortunate chapter was best forgotten. The Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, Mehmed IV, was not that happy with the proclaimed Messiah in his empire. He gave Tzvi the choice of shooting him with bow and arrow, which, if he would survive, it would be a miracle. So that would mean that he would definitely be the Messiah, or convert to Islam. As we all know, Tzvi converted to Islam, leaving his followers worldwide traumatized, and his name became Aziz Mehmet Effendi. The letter was definitely sent, but never reached Tzvi, as it became clear that he was not the Messiah. And the letter had very long been lost and only came back into the collection in 1933, when a German bookseller offered it to Etzreim because he felt that it belonged there. And in my view, the fact that it only came back into the collection in the 20th century saved it from the 17th century efforts to erase this piece of history. By the end of 1666, news of Tzvi's conversion to Islam had reached Amsterdam. The Jewish community leaders, the Parnasim, immediately took anti-messianic view. For example, regarding the book that you see on your right. It's called Fin de los Días, End of Days, by Moses Ben Gideon Abudiente. In this publication of the Spanish translation of his sermons on divine salvation, printed in the German city of Glückstadt in 1666, Moses Gideon Abudiente of Hamburg claims that the arrest of Tzvi was actually proof of his divine status and fulfillment of the biblical vision of the prophet Isaiah. The Mahamat, the board of governors of the Portuguese congregation, decided, and I quote, on the advice of the rabbis, unquote, to put anyone who owns a printed or a manuscript copy of the book under a ban. In Hamburg, the whole book was banned, and it is interesting that here in Amsterdam, the book wasn't banned, but the people who owned the book were banned. Talking about bans, another subject that we could go on about for hours, I guess. It's a very interesting subject as well. From 1666 on, the board of the congregation was very cautious towards Messianism. And while Kabbalistic thought in general seems to have been cultivated, the Kabbalistic tradition that developed in Tzvat, for example, that you have to walk 7 times around the beer in order to ward off evil spirits, is custom in the Portuguese congregation to the present day. Kabbalistic thoughts were discussed in many polemics that we also hold, and discussions in the school of Etzreim and the congregation during the 18th century. Now I want to tell you something about this famous man, Manasseh ben Israel. With him, Hebrew book printing in Amsterdam began. He was born in Lisbon in 1604, from where his family had to flee because of the Inquisition. They arrived in Amsterdam around the year 1616 and immediately became an active part of Jewish life in Amsterdam, and Manasseh was also enrolled in the school at Etzreim. In 1627, he printed his first Hebrew book. The book that you see next to him was printed in 1642, when the synagogue was visited by Dutch and English royalty. When the English Queen Henrietta Maria visited the Portuguese synagogue, Manasseh wrote a welcoming speech and uttered the famous words about how the Jewish newcomers in Amsterdam felt. And he said, "We no longer think of Castile as our fatherland, but Holland." And I'm sure that this was heartfelt. It does seem to contradict what I posed earlier that about the cherished Sephardic identity, but I'm also convinced by the evidence in our library that the Portuguese congregation in Amsterdam kept a very outspoken Sephardic soul and identity to this day, actually, as well as a deep connection with their new homeland, Amsterdam or the Netherlands. And we all know that it's possible to have more than just one identity. When he was 17 years old, he wrote his first book, Manasseh ben Israel, of course, a Hebrew grammar in Portuguese with the title Safar Beruba. This was never printed and is known only in manuscript in about 3 copies in the world, of which one is in our library. Manasseh was also rabbi of the congregation, and here we see that he signed a ketubah, a marriage contract, in 1655. And the style of on these little images is typical for the upper class at that time in Amsterdam, the style of clothing. In 1629, Menasse ben Israel started printing the Hebrew work of Joseph del Medigo about physics, metaphysics, astronomy, Kabbalah, and the name of this book is Sefer Elim. And this really got him into trouble with his board of governors. The members of the board of the congregation, the Parnasim, had to give permission for every book printed, and also in this case. But Manasseh had already started printing the work. And so, as not every Parnas knew Hebrew, Joseph Salomo was summoned by the board to translate the whole work into Portuguese and to read it aloud in order to enable the Parnasim to judge the work. Manasseh had to explain difficult passages of the text, and we know now that certain parts, especially with criticism on Kabbalah, were censored by the Parnasim and never printed. And we know that because Sefer Elim is a kind of play of questions and answers, and there are more questions in it than answers. So this is why we think that this book was censored in a form of self-censorship by the Muhammad. We can only guess that this was done to keep the congregation in line with the ideas of the Parnasim. And now I want to show you the oldest dated Hebrew manuscript in our collection. And not only in our collection, it's the oldest dated Hebrew manuscript in the Netherlands. And it's the Mishneh Torah of Moses Maimonides, copied by Barzillai ben Halevi ben Jacob Halevi in 1282 in Narbonne, the south of France. Maimonides was born in Cordoba in 1135, and he died in Cairo in 1204. In Hebrew literature, he is called Rambam, of course, the acronym of his name, and in Western culture from the Renaissance on Maimonides. He was an authority on halakha, and he also was a philosopher, doctor, and rabbi. In a letter to a friend, Maimonides describes his days. Every day I visit the Sultan until late afternoon. Then many patients are waiting for me, and sometimes the last patient leaves at 2 o'clock at night. On Shabbat, I teach the community. And this is the Mishneh Torah that we have in our collection. As it is from 1282, and if I'm not wrong, Maimonides passed away in 1208, it's very close to his living years, which makes it very authentic because this is a manuscript, and manuscripts were copied many times, and this would mean that you would have intentionally or unintentionally, you would have mistakes or in the manuscript. So it's absolutely it's a unique document. This work was censored. In Etzrim, the Mishneh Torah has 14 parts, of course, and in Etzrim we have parts 8 to 14. So the other parts are lost. We don't know where they are. And this is the very last part of the Mishneh Torah, where we find censorship by the Catholic Church. And this is the part where Maimonides talks about the fact that Jesus Christ could never have been the Messiah of the Jews. So every time that the censor saw the word Jesus Christ, Messiah, he erased it. And this censorship was not only meant for in order for Jews not to read it, but also Christians were very much interested in reading the Hebrew sources ad fontes, back to the sources. So it's censorship, of course, is always something that it means that someone else decides for you what you should and should not read. But it's also important to realize that it's it can be meant for different audiences. Also about the Mishneh Torah, I could talk for an hour. I won't do that. I will get to the last two books that I want to talk about. One is that we also have a Quran in our collection, a Spanish translation from the 17th century. It was written and translated by a former converso from our congregation. And this is a book I like very much. It was printed in Amsterdam. And I would like to conclude with this. It's called Mea Brachot, or the Orden de Bendiciones, 100 blessings, with blessings in Spanish and in Hebrew. The title page shows 6 symmetrical medallions depicting the 5 senses. The senses are captured in Spanish and the blessings in Hebrew, and I enlarged them somewhat so you can see. So this is hearing, Birkat Shofar. This is touch, Birkat Mila. This is, I can't see, but you can, I guess, sight, Birkat Levana. Then we have smell, Birkat Besamim. Then we have taste, Birkat Mazon. And the episode at the bottom refers to the title of the work. And it shows a man sowing a field. And that is a part from Bereshit, where it says that Isaac sowed that in that land and reaped in the same year 100-fold. And this is probably a complement to the owner of the manuscript from which this book was printed. And his name was Isaac Mattatya Aboab. The book basically is a practical guide for the congregation and also includes a Haggadah, a poem on ritual slaughter, the measurements of the mikveh, and information on the amount of flour to be used for the baking of bread. Mea Brachot is a wonderful example of a book that guides the former conversos in Amsterdam through their new Jewish life. And as you might have noticed, there are so many books in our collection, so many more books I could talk about and say much more about, which I can't do now. And well, as we said earlier, the collection of Etzraim is more than a collection of books. It is a mirror in which you can see the history and world of the Portuguese congregation in Amsterdam through the ages. And the 23,000 printed books and 600 manuscripts give us an insight into the lives and into the book production also of the congregation. It really is a window to an active community of the first Portuguese Jews that settled in Amsterdam. And everyone who wants to do research in the library can do that by making an appointment with me. And I'll show you this, not that slide, but this slide. So if you want to contact me, that is possible. I also want to tell you that our manuscript collection is digitized. It's fully digitized. So all the 600 manuscripts that we have are, and the printed books, half of them are cataloged, and you will find them on WorldCat. So thank you very much. And please, if you have any questions, I will be happy to answer them.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating, so informative and inspiring, really. Just a couple of questions I can see in the chat. Just based on, you mentioned that they're digitized. Are they available that someone can just Google them, or they have to have like just get in touch with you to sort of access them?
No, the website etzraimmanuscripts.nl is open for everyone, so you can see all the manuscripts on that website. Should you need a higher resolution than we have on the website, you can always contact me and ask me for certain pages in a higher resolution or the whole manuscript. That's possible. I mean, not for 20 books, of course, but should you need it for research and in a higher resolution, I can send them to you.
Wonderful. I mean, one of the projects that we want to try republish or raise awareness, translate, and we have even some of our volunteers on this call as well who work hard, and this would be an amazing starting place and resource. So that's wonderful. Another question is, until when was the Portuguese the language like actively used in Amsterdam?
For quite a long time, actually, until the beginning of the 19th century, the main language was Portuguese, and that also means that the I call it administration of the congregation was in Portuguese, which makes it very difficult. And you can imagine that a language changes through the years. And if you are able to read Portuguese, I think you can understand quite a lot. But I had an intern from Brazil, and I was very happy that she was able to read the Portuguese, and it took her half an hour, and then she said, "I don't understand what I am reading, because this Portuguese is old Portuguese. It's mixed with Dutch, with Hebrew, with everything, with Spanish. So it's quite difficult sometimes to read it, but it is in Portuguese until the beginning of the 19th century."
Wow. We'll get to Josh in a moment, who has his hand raised. Neil asks in the chat, how did the library survive the Nazi occupation?
Yeah, that's a very good and important question. Actually, the whole library was taken to Germany. The library was closed first and then confiscated and taken to Germany, to a place very close to Frankfurt. Hitler had this. I never know how to translate it. It's an institute for the research on the Jewish question. I don't know if this is the right translation. So he collected artwork, Jewish artwork, and books there. With we are not quite sure why exactly, but the Library of Etzrim also ended up there. Everything was put into crates and ended up there, at that place close to Frankfurt. But the Nazis never had time to open the crates towards the end of the war, so everything more or less came back, was brought back by the monuments men. So we were very lucky.
It's a miracle. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Josh, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Yes. Hi. Thanks. First of all, Heidi, my wife and I actually met you when we were in Amsterdam about 2 years ago, and you gave us a very gracious and really informative tour of the library. So just wanted to express my appreciation. So if anyone is in Amsterdam, really, it's a beautiful place to be. You mentioned that there were some aspects of practice in the community that were, corrected, and some rabbis were coming through to help to normalize, I guess, for lack of a better word, the halachic practice. What have you seen any other examples of kind of abnormal practice, or things that didn't fit, quote unquote, with other halachic practices, things that might have been pointed out by the Ashkenazi community, for example, or other communities? I think Amsterdam is fascinating in that it did allow for a wide degree of religious expression. So, what else is there, and how long did it persist?
Yeah, it's very interesting. What we see that I'm not an expert on halakha, so I think there are many more examples which I maybe don't know about. But what you can see in the congregation in the 17th century, especially in the beginning, is that the Parnasim the Mahamad was quite strict in every sense. When you read the minute books, it really, you see some very strong rules in there. For example, about printing of books, and of course we all know about the cherem, the ban, and there are more things that the Parnasim was strict about. I personally feel that this is typically something that happened during the 17th century, because what happened is that you had these hundreds and hundreds of conversos coming to the city, having to learn about Judaism, not knowing very much, and they were basically Catholic. So it was very important for the board to to have them all on the same page, and not running around with different ideas than the Parnasim wanted. So that is something that is very obvious, and that changed. They were less strict later on, but during the 17th century, it was really about educating and telling those people this is how Judaism is lived. And so it's very interesting to see that. I don't know if that answers your question exactly, but
It does. Thank you.
yeah.
Just as a quick follow-up, institutionally, did they import any of the kind of structure of an inquisition or type of body to investigate practice within the community? Is there any evidence of that?
No, there's no evidence of that. The congregation really was built after the community in Venice. So you see the whole structure is molded after what happened in Venice. But they adapted quite a lot of things. That is true. But there's no inquisitional kind of structure. No, not at all.
Thank you, Josh. Regarding the Mahamad and its relationship with the rabbis, first of all, the Mahamad, was it democratically elected, and or how did they reach that position? Was it just sort of the wealthiest people? And could you give us some insight in like the relationship between the Mahamad and the rabbis? Were the rabbis completely subservient to the decisions of the Mahamad and the board, or did the board generally like go for advice and consult the rabbis? How did that work, or was it different throughout the the different generations? Or
I think also that changed during the years. Basically, the Mahamad, the Parnasim, were the board of directors. So and the rabbis was personnel is not meant in a denigrating way, but they had to report, so in modern terms, had to report to their board of governors. There are examples where the rabbis were consulted, and sometimes my idea is that it's not so much that the Mahamad or the Parnasim consulted the rabbis, but the rabbis had to do what the Parnasim wanted them to do. So I feel that also meant that sometimes some rabbis were quite careful. And one example for me is Saul Levi Mortera, which was always very careful to print, for example, his sermons. I'm quite sure that he didn't like them. They were printed because some of his students wanted them to be printed. But he was very, very careful, and maybe he was careful because he knew that his own board would have to give permission for printing his sermons, and maybe he wouldn't get permission for them to be printed or for other manuscripts of his to be printed. He also wrote polemics, for example. How is the board elected? To be honest, at the moment I'm trying to prepare an article about that because it was always a little bit blurry. I think they were elected, and it's not something about. It doesn't have anything to do with money. I think the situation in Venice was different, but I can't say very much about it now because I just haven't read enough or found or researched enough about that.
thank you. There's one question coming in on the chat, which is about, I read somewhere that the Mahamad in Amsterdam cared about the intellectual property of the books written in the Kahal and created the source for copyright rules that are generally used nowadays in modern literature. Is that true? Can you confirm? You know about that?
I don't know about that, but this is definitely something I will dive into because it's very, very interesting, of course. I know that they always had a very specific relationship with books. I mean, books are always mentioned in the minute books. And as far as I know, in Venice, that didn't happen. Books were printed there as well. So, but I will have a look into that, because at the moment I'm trying to read the minute books, which is also very difficult because everything is in Portuguese. Yeah.
Just one question that occurred to me regarding the Talmud Torah school that that the Shelah or his son had praised, and what books would you recommend that one can look into to learn more about the curriculum in the school that you mentioned? Like they studied the trivium, rhetoric, logic, and sort of a broad syllabus. Is there any book in particular or writing that you could point me towards? Maybe not right now, but maybe afterwards. I'd love
Yeah.
to learn more about specifically what was studied at this school.
Yeah. Especially in the 20th century, a couple of books were written about it. I think that all of them, or nearly all of them, are in Dutch. But I will have a look into that, and I will point you to some books. It's very interesting to see the curriculum, and also to see that it changed during the years. And in my view, what I see in the collection is that in the first 100 years, the school actually was a kind of, well, you could call it first aid for knowing how to be Jewish. It sounds very strange, but with the converso background, it's you know why I say this. And after that, it was more the curriculum in order to train teachers and rabbis. So it changed. So the function that it had in the first about 100 years changed. And you can also see that because in Amsterdam, I don't know if you're aware of that, but you have the Pri-Etzreim, the Shelot or Teshuvot, that were printed, and it started at the end of the 17th century. And you can really see that this points more towards a rabbinic education, or education for teachers. So the curriculum changed, and it's very interesting to see that.
Yeah, we've had in one of our previous journals, Rav Natan Perez, who maybe probably know him, right? And he wrote about some of the responsa in the collection of the Pri Chaim.
Yeah.
So we hope to do more and raise awareness of these beautiful collections. Just final question. Just more personal, like what brought you to this role? I mean, I'm sure I speak on behalf of everyone. We really appreciate the work and the care, and so what brought you there?
Yeah, good question. I think my passion for books. I mean, it's the best place on earth to work. I think it's as you said earlier, I studied Hebrew at the University of Amsterdam, and as a student, I worked at the Biblioteca Rosentaliana, which is another very interesting collection in Amsterdam. Well, and when you're infected with the rare book virus, in combination with Jewish history, well, this is how it started. Actually, it's yeah.
Lovely, wonderful. So thank you so much. That was brilliant. We hope to have you again. You've already suggested 2 or 3 different other subjects, and all of them were like, we could definitely do a series on each of them. You know, the Rambam's Mishneh Torah, and
Yeah.
so thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining, and for everyone who watched the recordings, and really appreciate it. Have a wonderful day, wonderful evening, wherever you may be. And thank you once again, Heidi.
Thank you all for listening. Bye bye. Have a nice evening.